Venezuela changes the game overnight and no one saw it coming. Let me tell you about the morning of January 10, 2024. At first glance, it looked like just another routine announcement from Caracas, a government press release, a few lines in the financial wires, the kind of thing most analysts would skim over before their second cup of coffee. Nicolas Maduro, in a nationally televised address, declared that Venezuela would immediately annex the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory that makes up nearly two-thirds of neighboring Guyana. The justification? A hastily organized referendum, a new map, and a claim that the 1899 arbitral award, long recognized by international law, was null and void. Now, if you were watching the news that day, you probably saw the standard cycle of Guyana's president calling it an existential threat, the U.S. State Department issuing a stern condemnation, the UK and Brazil expressing deep concern. The media framed it as another chapter in Venezuela's long history of authoritarian posturing. Maduro, isolated and desperate, lashing out to distract from his domestic failures. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looked like. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this wasn't just another empty threat. This was a calculated, high-stakes gambit, one that caught Washington, Beijing, and Moscow off guard in ways that will reverberate for years. And if you think this is just about a disputed jungle territory, you're missing the real story. Let me explain why. The official what they want you to believe. The story the Western media ran with was Maduro, facing crushing sanctions, a collapsing economy, and dwindling support even among his own base, needed a distraction. The Essequibo dispute, long dormant, was the perfect issue to rally nationalist sentiment. A December 2023 referendum, where 95% of voters allegedly supported annexation, gave him the pret. Then came the new maps, the military exercises near the border, and the announcement that Venezuela would begin issuing oil licenses in the disputed waters. The U.S. response was predictable. The State Department called the move provocative and unacceptable, while the Pentagon announced joint military exercises with Guyana. The UK, which still maintains a colonial-era claim to the region through its support for the 1899 arbitration, sent a warship to the area. Brazil, caught in the middle, beefed up its northern border defenses. The narrative was Maduro was bluffing, and the West would call it. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes that this is just another case of a rogue state throwing a tantrum. And it assumes that the US and its allies have the situation under control. None of those assumptions hold up under scrutiny. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the referendum. The official turnout was 10.5 million voters, an impossible number in a country where the opposition boycotted the last election, where millions have fled, and where the government has systematically dismantled independent institutions. Even the most generous estimates put Venezuela's voting age population at around 18 million, with only about 12 million still in the country. So how did 10.5 million people vote? The answer is they didn't. This was a manufactured result, designed to create the illusion of overwhelming public support. But here's where it gets interesting. The referendum wasn't just about domestic propaganda, it was a signal. A signal to someone. And that someone wasn't in Washington. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, there were a series of high-level meetings that didn't make the headlines. In November, Maduro's top intelligence chief, General Ivan Hernandez Dalla, traveled to Moscow for undisclosed talks with Russian military officials. Around the same time, a Chinese delegation, officially there for energy cooperation, met with Venezuela's oil minister in Caracas. Then, in early December, a Venezuelan military delegation visited Tehran. None of these meetings were publicized. None were denied when asked about later. Now, why would Russia, China, and Iran all be interested in a territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana? Because this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the oil. The Essequibo region isn't just jungle, it's sitting on one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery in Guyana's offshore Stabroek Block estimated reserves of at least 11 billion barrels, and that number has only grown since. For context, that's more than the entire proven reserves of Mexico. And Venezuela? It's home to the largest oil reserves on the planet, But years of mismanagement and sanctions have crippled its production. Maduro needs that oil not just for revenue, but for leverage. But here's the US and its allies don't control Guyana's oil. Exxon does. And Exxon, while American, operates with a level of autonomy that makes it a de facto player in its own right. The US government can condemn Venezuela all it wants, but if Exxon's drilling platforms are in the crosshairs, that's a different kind of problem. So what's really happening? Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, is testing the limits of US resolve in its own backyard. And the US, distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East, is struggling to respond. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. We're in the middle of a fundamental shift in the global order, one that's been building for decades but is now accelerating at an alarming pace. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of the idea that it could act as the world's sole superpower, enforcing its will through military dominance, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. But that era is ending. Russia, China, and a loose coalition of revisionist states are actively working to dismantle US hegemony, not by challenging it head-on, but by eroding its influence in key regions. Latin America has always been a critical battleground in this struggle. During the Cold War, the US treated the region as its backyard, overthrowing governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua when they stepped out of line. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, Washington lost interest. And in that vacuum, new players emerged. China, over the last 20 years, has become the largest trading partner for most of South America. Russia has rebuilt its military ties, selling arms to Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. Iran has extended its influence through cultural and religious outreach. And now, with the US distracted by other crises, these powers are making their move. Venezuela's annexation gambit isn't just about Guyana, it's a test. A test of US resolve, of NATO's cohesion, of whether the West is still willing to defend its interests in the Western Hemisphere. And so far, the response has been underwhelming. The US sent a few warships. The UK sent one. Brazil, which has the most to lose from a regional conflict, is hedging its bets. Meanwhile, Russia has quietly increased its military presence in Venezuela, and China has offered diplomatic support. This is how empires decline, not with a bang, but with a series of small, ignored provocations that add up to a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Military and strategic why the hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has two military bases, in one at Camp Ghana in Georgetown, and another at the Chetty Juggin International Airport. These aren't large installations, they're mostly used for training and counter-narcotics operations, but their presence is a red line for Venezuela. Maduro has already warned that any US military action in Guyana would be considered an act of war. The problem is, the US has no good military options here. Venezuela's military, while weakened by years of sanctions and brain drain, is still one of the most formidable in Latin America. It has Russian S-300 air defense systems, Chinese radar networks, and a stockpile of Iranian drones. More importantly, it has the home field advantage. Any US intervention would require a massive logistical effort, and even then, the risk of escalation is enormous. Remember Iraq? Afghanistan? Libya? The US has a long history of underestimating the costs of military intervention. And in this case, the costs would be catastrophic. Venezuela isn't just a military target, it's a geopolitical tripwire. Russia and China have both warned that they would respond to any US aggression, and while they're unlikely to go to war over Guyana, they could easily escalate in other theaters: Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea. The hawks in Washington who think this can be solved with a quick surgical strike are either delusional or lying. This isn't Grenada in 1983. This is a regional power with foreign backers, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, in a part of the world where the US is already stretched thin. And that's before we even get to the economic fallout. Venezuela's oil exports are already under sanctions, but if Maduro follows through on his threat to seize Exxon's assets in the Essequibo, it would send shockwaves through global energy markets. Oil prices would spike, inflation would rise, and the US would be forced to choose between enforcing its sanctions or making concessions to Caracas. This is the kind of dilemma that keeps policymakers up at night. And right now, the US doesn't have a good answer. The domestic political why this is about more than foreign policy. Here's something most analysts aren't talking: this crisis is happening at the worst possible time for the Biden administration. 2024 is an election year. Inflation is still a major concern for voters. The border crisis is dominating headlines. And now, suddenly, the US is facing a potential military confrontation in Latin America, one that could send gas prices soaring just as voters are heading to the polls. The White House knows this. That's why their response has been so cautious. They can't afford another foreign policy disaster, not with Trump already attacking them on Ukraine and Israel. But they also can't afford to look weak. So they're stuck in a no-win: condemn Venezuela too strongly, and they risk escalation; do too little, and they look feckless. And then there's Florida. Florida is the largest swing state in the country, and it's home to over 200,000 Venezuelan exiles, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. These voters are a key part of the Republican coalition, and they're demanding action. Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, and even Ron DeSantis have all called for a tougher response. If Biden doesn't deliver, he risks losing a critical block of voters in November. This is how domestic politics distorts foreign policy. The US isn't responding to Venezuela based on a careful assessment of national interests, it's responding based on electoral calculations. And that's a recipe for bad decisions. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the bluff holds. In this scenario, Maduro's annexation gambit fizzles out. The US and its allies impose new sanctions, but Venezuela backs down from any actual military action. The crisis de-escalates, and the status quo, with Guyana controlling the Essequibo, remains in place. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has already burned his bridges. If he backs down now, he looks weak in front of his own military and his foreign backers. And in authoritarian regimes, weakness is often fatal. Scenario 2, controlled escalation. This is the most likely outcome. Venezuela doesn't invade Guyana outright, but it starts a slow-motion annexation. It issues oil licenses in disputed waters, builds military outposts near the border, and uses proxy forces to destabilize Guyana from within. The US responds with sanctions, but stops short of military action. Russia and China provide economic and diplomatic cover. The crisis drags on for years, with periodic flare-ups, but never quite boiling over into full-scale war. This is the frozen conflict model: think Ukraine before 2022, or Cyprus. It's messy, it's unstable, but it's better than the alternative. Scenario 3, full-blown crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, launches a limited military incursion into the Essequibo. Maybe it's a humanitarian mission to protect Venezuelan settlers. Maybe it's a cyber attack on Guyana's oil infrastructure. Whatever the pretext, the result is the Guyana calls for US military support. The US faces an impossible choice. Does it intervene, risking a wider war with Venezuela? Or does it stand aside, sending a message to every US ally in the world that Washington won't defend them? If the US chooses the first option, we could see a regional conflict that makes the Iraq War look like a skirmish. If it chooses the second, the US loses credibility in Latin America and beyond. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences will be catastrophic. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's out even further. Because this crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the fundamental failure of US grand strategy over the last 30 years. Since the end of the Cold War, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that it could reshape the world in its own image through military intervention, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. The results have been disastrous. In the 1990s, we had the end-of-history delusion, the belief that democracy and free markets would spread naturally, without the need for force. Then came 9/11, and the US pivoted to a policy of endless war in the Middle East. The result? Trillions of dollars wasted, thousands of lives lost, and a region that's more unstable than ever. Now, we're seeing the same pattern in Latin America. The US has spent decades trying to isolate Venezuela, imposing sanctions that have crippled its economy but failed to topple Maduro. Meanwhile, China and Russia have stepped in, offering Venezuela an alternative to US dominance. This is the problem with liberal. It assumes that the US can control the world through force and economic pressure. But the world doesn't work that way. Other powers have their own interests, their own alliances, their own ways of pushing back. And now, we're seeing the consequences. Venezuela's annexation gambit is a direct challenge to US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And if the US can't respond effectively, it sends a message to every other revisionist: the American empire is in decline. This isn't just about Guyana. It's about the future of the global order. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? How should the US respond to this crisis without making things worse? First, we need to accept the era of US unipolarity is over. The world is becoming multipolar, and the US needs to adapt. That means recognizing that other powers, Russia, China, even Iran, have legitimate interests in regions like Latin America. It means accepting that we can't control every country, and that sometimes the best policy is containment, not regime change. Second, we need to stop relying on sanctions as a first resort. Sanctions have failed in Venezuela. They've failed in Iran. They've failed in Russia. And yet, every time there's a crisis, the US reaches for the same tool. It's time to admit that sanctions often hurt the wrong people, the civilians, not the elites, and that they push countries into the arms of US adversaries. Third, we need to rebuild our alliances in Latin America. The US has spent decades treating the region as an afterthought, focusing instead on the Middle East and Asia. That needs to change. We need to invest in economic development, in infrastructure, in education. We need to offer Latin American countries a real alternative to Chinese loans and Russian arms. And finally, we need to stop pretending that military force is the solution to every problem. The US has a habit of intervening in countries it doesn't understand, with consequences that are always worse than expected. Venezuela is no different. Any military action would be a disaster, and we need to accept that before it's too late. This isn't isolationism. It's realism. And right now, realism is what the US desperately needs. The bigger why this matters for all of us. Let me leave you with this. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis isn't just a regional dispute. It's a symptom of a much larger unraveling of the post-Cold War order. The US is trying to hold on to a global dominance that it can no longer sustain. Other powers are pushing back. And in the middle of this struggle, the risks of miscalculation, of escalation, of outright war, are higher than they've been in decades. This isn't just about oil. It's about power. It's about who gets to shape the 21st century. And right now, the US is losing. But here's the good: it's not too late to change course. The US still has the world's largest economy, the most powerful military, and the most dynamic society. But it needs to start making smarter choices. It needs to stop pretending that it can control the world through force. And it needs to start accepting that other countries have their own interests, and that sometimes, the best policy is to let them pursue them. This is the moment we're living in, where the old rules no longer apply, and the new ones haven't been written yet. Venezuela's move on Guyana isn't just a border dispute, it's a test case for how the world's great powers will respond when a smaller nation decides to rewrite the map by force. And the answers we're getting so far are deeply unsettling. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Maduro's desperation or Guyana's sudden oil wealth. It's about the quiet but seismic shift happening in military power projection across the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, a place where it could intervene at will, prop up dictators when convenient, and ignore the region when it wasn't. But that era is ending, and Venezuela is the first major test of what comes in. Let me explain why this matters for US military strategy. The Pentagon has spent the last 20 years obsessing over counterinsurgency in the Middle East and great power competition with China. Latin America? It's been an afterthought, relegated to the Southern Command's budget crumbs. The last time the U.S. had a serious military presence in the region was during the Cold War, when it backed coups in Chile, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Since then, the U.S. has relied on a mix of economic pressure, drug interdiction, and the occasional special forces raid like the 2019 operation to capture Maduro's inner circle, which ended in farce when the mercenaries were captured before they even reached Caracas. But here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. no longer has the military dominance in Latin America that it once did. Russia and China have been filling the vacuum, not with boots on the ground, but with arms sales, intelligence cooperation, and economic leverage. Venezuela is the perfect example. Since 2006, Russia has sold Caracas over $11 billion in military equipment, including Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. China has provided drones, radar systems, and cybersecurity support. And Iran? It's been quietly helping Venezuela build a domestic arms industry, including the production of drones and ballistic missiles. This isn't some abstract threat. These are real capabilities that change the calculus for any U.S. military intervention. In 2019, when the Trump administration flirted with the idea of a military option to remove Maduro, the Pentagon ran war games that reportedly showed a high risk of failure. Why? Because Venezuela's military, though corrupt and poorly trained, is now equipped with advanced Russian air defenses that could shoot down U.S. aircraft. And because any invasion would likely trigger a prolonged insurgency, with Cuban and Russian advisors providing intelligence and logistical support. Here's another thing the establishment doesn't like to talk: the U.S. has lost its moral high ground in the region. For every country that still sees the U.S. as a partner, like Colombia or Brazil, there are others that remember U.S. support for dictators, coups, and economic exploitation. When Maduro accuses the U.S. of trying to steal Venezuela's oil, he's tapping into a deep well of historical resentment. And when he points to U.S. sanctions as the reason for Venezuela's economic collapse, he's not entirely wrong. The sanctions have devastated the country's economy, but they've also given Maduro a convenient scapegoat. So what happens if Venezuela actually invades Guyana? The U.S. has already signaled that it won't stand idly by. In December 2023, the U.S. Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, including flights by B-1B bombers over the disputed Essequibo region. The message was the U.S. will defend Guyana's territorial integrity. But here's the U.S. doesn't have the same military footprint in the region that it did during the Cold War. The last U.S. military base in South America, in Ecuador, closed in 2009. The U.S. still has a presence in Colombia and Honduras, but nothing that could support a large-scale intervention in Venezuela. And that's where things get dangerous. Because if the U.S. can't project power effectively, it might be tempted to rely on proxies, or worse, on covert action. We've seen this movie before. In 1961, the CIA backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, which ended in disaster. In 2002, the U.S. tacitly supported a coup against Hugo Chavez, which failed when the Venezuelan military rallied to his side. Any attempt to overthrow Maduro through force would likely end the same way, with a failed operation that strengthens his regime and pushes Venezuela even closer to Russia and China. But the real risk isn't just a failed intervention. It's escalation. If Venezuela invades Guyana and the U.S. responds with airstrikes or a naval blockade, Russia and China could step in to support Maduro. Russia has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in the past, and China has a growing interest in the region's resources. The last thing the U.S. needs is a proxy war in its own hemisphere, but that's exactly where we're headed if cooler heads don't prevail. So what's the alternative? The U.S. needs to accept that it can't control Latin America through force. Instead, it needs to focus on rebuilding its diplomatic and economic influence in the region. That means offering real alternatives to Chinese loans and Russian arms. It means investing in infrastructure, education, and trade, not just in countries that toe the U.S. line, but in those that are drifting toward America's adversaries. And it means accepting that Latin America is no longer a passive player in global geopolitics. The region has its own interests, its own alliances, and its own agency. The US can either work with that reality or be left behind by it. Let me be, I'm not saying the US should abandon its interests in Latin America. But it needs to stop pretending that it can dictate outcomes through military power alone. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis is a wake-up call. The post-Cold War order is over, and the US needs to adapt or risk being outmaneuvered by powers that are playing a smarter, more patient game. The question now is whether Washington is capable of that kind of strategic thinking. Because if it isn't, we're going to see a lot more crises like this one, and a lot more close calls that could push the world toward a conflict none of us can afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Guyana's oil or Maduro's desperation, it's about the unraveling of Venezuela's internal political order, and that's where things get really dangerous. The establishment narrative in Washington and Brussels treats Venezuela as a monolith, a dictatorship where Maduro's grip on power is absolute. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The reality is far messier, and the cracks in the regime are widening in ways that could either stabilize the country or plunge it into chaos. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's government isn't just a one-man show. It's a coalition of factions, military hardliners, Chavista ideologues, and opportunistic business elites, all held together by a mix of repression, patronage, and sheer survival instinct. The military, in particular, is the real kingmaker here. The top brass, including Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez and the head of the Strategic Operational Command, General Domingo Hernandez Larez, have been the backbone of the regime since the 2019 coup attempt against Maduro. But their loyalty isn't ideological, it's transactional. They've been bought off with control over key industries, from oil to gold mining, and they're not about to give that up without a fight. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's recent moves, like the referendum on Essequibo and the military buildup, aren't just about distracting from domestic problems. They're about consolidating power within the regime itself. The military's support isn't guaranteed, and Maduro knows it. The last time he faced a serious internal challenge was in 2020, when a group of dissident officers, including former National Guard Captain Javier Nieto Quintero, plotted to overthrow him. The plot was foiled, but it revealed something: there are factions within the military that see Maduro as a liability, not a leader. If the economy collapses further, or if the US tightens sanctions to the point of strangulation, those factions could make a move. But here's the: even if the military turns on Maduro, it doesn't mean Venezuela will suddenly become a democracy. The most likely scenario is a palace coup, where a new strongman, perhaps someone like Padrino Lopez or even Diosdado Cabello, the powerful Chavista insider, takes over and promises stability. That's what happened in 2018, when Maduro's re-election was widely seen as fraudulent, but the military stood by him because they feared chaos more than they feared him. The same calculus applies today. The generals aren't Democrats, they're pragmatists. They'll back whoever can keep the money flowing and the protests suppressed. Now, let's talk about the opposition. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Juan Guaido's failure to unseat Maduro in 2019 proved that the opposition is weak and divided. That's partly true, but it's also a convenient excuse for inaction. The reality is that the opposition has been systematically dismantled by the regime. Guaido's interim government was a noble experiment, but it was always going to fail without real leverage. The US and its allies bet everything on sanctions and diplomatic isolation, but they never offered a credible alternative to Maduro's rule. The result? The opposition fractured, with some factions pushing for negotiations while others called for regime change. That division is still there, and it's not going away anytime soon. But here's where things get interesting. The opposition isn't just sitting on its hands. There are signs of a new strategy emerging, one that's less about street protests and more about building parallel institutions. Take the case of Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won the primary election in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote. Maduro's government barred her from running in the 2024 presidential election, but she's still a force to be reckoned with. Her platform, economic liberalization, anti-corruption, and reintegration with the West, resonates with a population that's exhausted by 25 years of Chavismo. The question is whether she can translate that support into real political power. The regime's response to Machado's rise has been repression. In the weeks after her primary victory, the government arrested dozens of opposition activists, including her campaign manager, and accused them of plotting a coup. But here's the repression only works up to a Venezuela's economy is in shambles, with inflation running at over 200% in 2023 and GDP per capita lower than it was in the 1950s. The country's oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 barrels per day today. The black market is the only thing keeping the country afloat, and even that's under strain. The regime can't keep the lights on, let alone deliver basic services. That's a recipe for unrest, and no amount of propaganda about the Essequibo can change that. So what's the most likely scenario? I see three possibilities, each with its own risks and opportunities. The first is a managed transition, where Maduro or his successor negotiates a deal with the opposition to hold free and fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. The regime has no incentive to give up power, and the opposition has no leverage to force its hand. The last round of negotiations in Mexico in 2021 collapsed when Maduro walked away, and there's no reason to think he'll be more accommodating now. The US could sweeten the deal by offering sanctions relief, but that would require a level of diplomatic flexibility that Washington has so far been unwilling to show. The second scenario is a prolonged stalemate, where Maduro clings to power but the country continues to deteriorate. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. The regime will keep using repression and propaganda to maintain control, while the opposition remains divided and ineffective. The economy will limp along, with periodic crises, hyperinflation, power outages, food shortages, keeping the population on edge. The risk here is that the stalemate becomes permanent, turning Venezuela into a failed state on the doorstep of the US. That's a nightmare scenario for Washington, but it's also one that could drag on for years. The third scenario is the most a sudden collapse. This could happen if the military fractures, if the economy implodes, or if a popular uprising spirals out of control. The regime has shown that it's willing to use extreme violence to stay in power. Remember the 2017 protests, when security forces killed over 100 people and arrested thousands. But if the military splits, all bets are off. We could see a civil war, a mass exodus of refugees, or even a foreign intervention. Russia and China would likely step in to prop up the regime, while the US and its allies would face pressure to do something. The result would be a geopolitical powder keg, with Venezuela becoming a battleground for great power competition. Now, let's talk about what this means for the US. The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that Venezuela is a problem to be solved through pressure and isolation. But that approach has failed for over a decade. The sanctions have hurt the regime, but they've also hurt ordinary Venezuelans, and they've pushed Maduro closer to Russia and China. The US needs a new strategy, one that recognizes that Venezuela is a sovereign country with its own agency, not a pawn in a geopolitical chess game. Here's what that strategy should look like. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a monolith. There are factions within the regime that are open to negotiation, and the US should be engaging with them discreetly. Second, the US needs to offer a clear path to sanctions relief in exchange for real reforms, free elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to repression. Third, the US needs to work with its allies in Latin America to isolate Maduro diplomatically while offering incentives for a peaceful transition. And fourth, the US needs to prepare for the worst-case scenario, a collapse, by working with regional partners to manage a potential refugee crisis and prevent foreign powers from exploiting the chaos. The bottom line is Venezuela is at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming months will shape the country's future for decades. The US can either continue its failed policy of pressure and isolation, or it can adapt to the new reality and work toward a solution that serves both its interests and those of the Venezuelan people. The first path leads to more instability and conflict. The second path is harder, but it's the only one that offers a chance for a better future. The question is whether Washington is willing to take it. Because if it isn't, we're going to see a lot more crises like this one, and a lot more suffering for the people who can least afford it.